Hi, I'm John Stone Street, host of the BreakPoint podcast and president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Later on today, the House of Representatives will be voting on the Equality Act. It's largely procedural. The decision seems to already be in. Not enough time has been given to really look under the hood of the Equality Act and see the dramatic changes that it could make. I asked my friend, Dr. Ryan Anderson, who's the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, to come on in a quick interview and describe the scope and the scale and the depth of the Equality Act's infringement, not only on religious freedom, but on our own sense of calling and our ability to perform our work to the best of our ability and with the best of our neighbors in mind. So here's my interview with Dr. Ryan Anderson. I was looking at my story list for the week going, wow, it's been a heck of a week. And in fact, one of those stories this week had to do with you in particular and the book on the transgender issue, which you wrote, called When Harry Became Sally. As I said on a BreakPoint commentary this past week, I think along with Abigail Shire's book, it kind of gives the best framing of what's happening in the issue. Hers does a lot more of that kind of socio-cultural sorts of things, particularly with junior high girls and what some people have identified as rapid onset gender dysphoria that we're seeing in junior highs across the world. Yours really dives deep on the psychology of it in very Ryan Anderson form. It's very thoughtful, it's very measured, it's very reasoned, it's straight shooting, but it's not alarmist, and it's certainly not angry. And Amazon kicked you off the platform this week. But you know, Ryan, I got notices over the last year from about 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different books that years ago I had on an independent sellers page on Amazon. And I honestly, it's been inactive for a while, but you know, hey, we're dropping this one, we're dropping this one, we're dropping this one, and I'm starting to see it. And some of those books were hateful. Some of those books weren't clear. They were more alarmist than reasoned. Yours is like, well, it's kind of like banning Max Lucado or complaining about Max Lucado being at the Episcopal National Cathedral in D.C. That's about as nice as you can get. Yours is about as reasoned as you can get. And for the record, you can still get When Harry Became Sally off the BreakPoint bookstore. Go to breakpoint.org, click on the little button there that says store. But that was I'm sure that was surreal to wake up Monday morning and realize that you'd been banned from Amazon.
Yeah, I mean, surreal is a very good word to use it because, I mean, there's a lot to say here, but one is like, thank you for the way you just described the book. Like, I like to think that that is true, which raises the question of if that type of a book is unacceptable to Amazon, then is there any book that expresses kind of an orthodox, biblical, natural law perspective on gender identity? Is any of that going to be permissible to Amazon? And then it also, people are like, look, the market's working. You know, Ryan's going on TV shows and radio shows and podcasts talking about the book. They're selling it from, the BreakPoint bookstore. Yes, true to a certain extent for me. But how many other authors who don't have as high of a profile, who don't have as much of a network of, partners like BreakPoint and, whose books have been canceled without any of us knowing about it? And when Amazon drives such a huge share of book sales in the US, what is that doing for them? What is it doing for publishers who are saying, we just shouldn't publish a title on this topic with that perspective because we're afraid it won't sell well if Amazon cancels it? What does this do for consumers? Because look, part of this is the idea that you only read books that you agree with, right? And that's nonsensical. Like Amazon seems to be saying, well, the only reason someone would buy this book is if they already agree with it. I mean, Amazon's doing a disservice to its liberal and progressive readers who actually want to be informed about what conservatives think about the issue. So it's really, really bad for our culture. It's bad for book authors. It's bad for book readers. It's bad for book publishers. I don't see anyone who this is good for.
Yeah, I agree. And when I originally asked you to come on the program here so that we could dive deep, it was on the Equality Act, which is kind of a government angled enforcement of this new ideology. And that's been married with big tech. And those are two formidable forces. And so, I mean, the lesson for us is knowing, how, in what ways are we going to be silenced? In what ways must we still speak up? How can we speak up? and so on. So that's where I want to get into. But I mean, I think it needs to at least be mentioned, as many people have, that on Amazon you can still get a copy of Mein Kampf. So that's still there. But When Harry Became Sally is beyond the pale. But it's a serious issue, because this ideology on the transgender issue, as we've said many times on BreakPoint, first of all, is sociologically, psychologically, physiologically, biologically, anthropologically weak. And so it's really moving forward on a coercion, a strategy of coercion, big tech, and then government forces. We saw the Biden administration Department of Education pull back the clarification that affects women's sports in Connecticut this week. And of course, the Equality Act is on the table. The Equality Act is a game changer. We've talked about that over and over and over again. It takes all of these kind of incremental things that maybe came out of the Bostock Supreme Court decision about hiring, or the Dear Colleague letter from the Obama administration, which I'm sure will be re-released in a couple weeks. It takes all of that and codifies it essentially into law across the board. It's a big deal. So the Equality Act on the floor of the House this week. Just give us the status of the legislation. In the past, this has come up. It didn't really have a great chance of succeeding. Are those chances greater now than ever? Give us just kind of a lay of the land legislatively.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and the first thing to say there is that if you were, one, big tech can censor, and big tech can shape a lot about our culture, and so we should be concerned about that. But if you're concerned about the power big tech has, just wait till you see what big government can do to censor and to coerce and to shape public discussion on issues and actual public actions. And so as bad as kind of like the Amazon thing is, and Facebook and Twitter have gotten in on the game in various times and places with other books and ads and things like that, imagine the entire full weight of the federal government coming down. And that's what the Equality Act is. And it goes well beyond Bostock, because Bostock only reinterpreted what the word sex means in certain contexts where we have federal laws that use the word sex. But for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the word sex is used in Title VII, which governs employment law. It's not used in Title II, which governs public accommodations, and it's not used in Title VI, which governs federal funding. The Equality Act adds both sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity to all of the various titles, and then it explicitly exempts itself from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So what does this mean when you put it all together? There's going to be the federal government redefining every more or less private institution as a place of public accommodation, because it broadens the definition of public accommodations, Title II. And it then says if you're a public accommodation or if you receive any federal funding, which when you add it all up, that's almost every institution in America as either going to be a public accommodation or a recipient of federal funding. And it now says that on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity, you have to abide by the new orthodoxy or else, and a variety of penalties. The legislative situation, we're recording this Thursday morning. I don't know when it's going to post, but just so listeners know, later today, Thursday afternoon at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, the House of Representatives is having a floor vote on this. This bill was only introduced at the end of last week. This is a rush. No time for hearings, no time for markup, no time for debate. They are voting on it less than a week after they introduced it. Then it will be sent to the Senate, and a lot hinges on, first, whether or not we retain the legislative filibuster. If there's the legislative filibuster in place, it doesn't get past the procedural vote, because there will at least be 41 senators who object to this. If they get rid of the legislative filibuster, then it really depends on, first, can McConnell keep the entire GOP caucus against it? And we have a good indication here that Sue Collins, who had supported the Equality Act last Congress, has announced she's against it, that they didn't make the revisions that she had requested, so it's not as extreme as it is. And so then, all right, that would be a 50-50 split, and it's going to come down to someone like Joe Manchin. Manchin has announced that he won't support Biden's nominee for OMB because of extreme comments that she has made. Will Manchin say that he won't support the Equality Act because it's too extreme? I mean, that's the kind of like head counting, vote counting perspective. And so a lot hinges on the Senate here.
A lot of hinges on the Senate, and I want to go back to something you said about the that this kind of is a runaround RFRA laws, because that's interesting. So the Equality Act isn't new; it's been introduced and largely rejected for years now, right? I mean, it goes way
Always
back.
rejected. It's never passed both houses of Congress. Yeah.
Yeah, it's never gotten close. And of course, President Biden ran on a promise that he would sign it into law in the first 100 days. That was unlikely until the Georgia Senate, runoffs went and gave control of the Senate to the Democrats. Then suddenly, it's a whole new escalated, possibility than it's ever been in the history of the Equality Act. But one of the unique things here is not only kind of this running through categories of sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in all of these titles. It's also this runaround of RFRA laws. So walk us through, how is that even possible?
Yeah. So let me back up. In the 1990s, early 1990s, there's a Supreme Court decision, Employment Division v. Smith, written by Justice Antonin Scalia, where Scalia takes the view that the First Amendment doesn't require strict scrutiny the way that they had been interpreting the First Amendment, but instead, if it's a facially neutral, generally applicable law that burdens religious liberty, that law passes constitutional muster. So in I believe it was 93, Chuck Schumer was the lead sponsor in the House of Representatives. Ted Kennedy was the lead sponsor in the Senate, and then Bill Clinton was the president who signed into law the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what it did was it restored the legal standard that was the pre-Smith legal standard, which is that if the government burdens a sincere act of religious belief, it needs to have a compelling government interest that's being pursued in the least restrictive way possible. Generally applicable, facially neutral is not good enough. It needs to be compelling, and it needs to be least restrictive. This is the law that protected the owners of Hobby Lobby and that protected the Little Sisters of the Poor. But it's a law, it's a statute, it's not a constitutional provision. So Congress can say, oh, well, that statute doesn't apply to this other statute that we're passing. And so that's what they're doing here. They're going to say, and this will be the first time, if the Equality Act became law, this would be the first time in the, what is it now, almost 30-year history of RFRA, that Congress had exempted one of its bills from religious freedom protections. Now, religious freedom is one of the reasons to be concerned about the Equality Act. So too is female privacy, female safety, equality, medicine, the well-being of children, which is also why fairness for all isn't an adequate solution, right? Some people are saying, oh, don't go for the Equality Act, go for fairness for all. Fairness for all addresses some of the religious liberty concerns, but not all of them. And then it does nothing on the privacy, the safety, the equality, and the medical things. I mean, it would repeat all of the mistakes of the Equality Act on those areas. So anyway, for listeners, there's a lot of moving parts going on here, and so you got to pay attention.
And we want our listeners to go back to breakpoint.org. We've been covering both the Equality Act, and then Ryan just mentioned fairness for all. We've talked a lot about that as a so-called compromise and how, in our view, it dramatically fails to protect people, especially outside of explicitly defined religious institutions. Not to mention, to go back to Becerra, who is, been nominated for HHS. The last time we're both old enough to remember when HHS defined who counts as a religious institution and who doesn't. And Rick Warren's Saddleback Church would have been questionable. So just so everybody needs to know, this is, and not to mention,
the Little Sisters of the Poor didn't qualify. When you think about it that way, an order of Catholic nuns
did not apply. Yeah, and certainly we talked this week, Ryan, about Jack Phillips' ongoing challenges on a hand. Now, this would leave bakers, florists. This would leave people outside in the cold. So I want to just talk a little bit about the scope and scale, because we talked about, it's Title II, it's Title VII, it's all these different titles where sex, sexual orientation, gender identity gets now kind of backlogged or read back into the law. Let's talk about the scope of this. So, education, employment, institutions, medicine, and so on. Just give us just a quick scope. I mean, how sweeping is this?
Sure. So, what it would say is that any institution that receives federal funding, and every, public entity, institution that will be now defined as a public accommodation, which would include more or less every healthcare institution, every school, because public schools or private schools that somehow receive any federal financial
Right.
assistance, all of them will now be classified.
What about like camps, right? So you have the camping industry, Christian camps. There's tens of thousands of students that go to Christian camps. So the public accommodation language has been really squishy over the last several decades.
I
What
think,
counts and what doesn't?
I would have to go back and, reread the precise definition they used. But my sense is that, yeah, camps would count as public
Homeless shelters?
accommodations. Homeless shelters, definitely. They mentioned shelters explicitly. They mentioned medical institutions explicitly, healthcare institutions, shelters. And what this means is that, let's say you're a battered women's shelter, you would have to allow men who identify as women to spend the night at that shelter. And, for people, fortunate enough to never have to have spent the night at a battered women's shelter, which I imagine is, a significant portion of our audience right now. This is not like spending the night at the Ritz-Carlton where you have like a nice fluffy king-size bed and like a private room. This is like, imagine something that looks like a gymnasium with a cot every couple of feet. And it's entirely understandable why these women who've already been victimized and abused wouldn't want to have a man who identifies as a woman sleeping in the cot right next to them. Right? This isn't
just traumatic. Just 2 weeks ago, Ryan, on the Daily's podcast, which is a New York Times podcast, they were talking about a scandal in a homeless shelter in New York City, and how the owner had victimized a woman, and just hearing that ongoing trauma in her voice on a national media platform like the New York Times Daily podcast was stunning. And that's what we're talking about times however many women. All right, so we talked about schools. What else? What else?
So let me say something about medicine, because this is really. We had mentioned that Fairness for All would leave out people like the bakers, the florists, the photographers. Both the Equality Act and Fairness for All would also have huge implications for people of faith who want to be medical professionals, but then also just like the actual like hospitals, healthcare plans, insurance plans. And regardless of whether or not you're a person of faith, but you just think that sex reassignment procedures are bad medicine, or you're a parent who wants good medicine for your kids. So let me say two things about what it would do. First, it would require what the ideologues call now, gender affirmation care. Right? It's what they used to call sex reassignment surgeries. Then it was gender confirmation. Now it's gender affirmation. Right? The whole idea here that the appropriate medical response to gender dysphoria is puberty blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, and then surgery. And the argument would be, well, it's discrimination based on gender identity if you don't prescribe those procedures, perform those procedures, and pay for those procedures when you would prescribe, perform, and pay for a different patient. So let's say you have a man with low testosterone, you would prescribe testosterone, you would do this testosterone therapy, you would pay for it for him, but you won't do it for a woman who wants to identify as a man. Let's say you're a surgeon, you would perform a double mastectomy in the case of breast cancer, but you wouldn't do it for the high school girl who wants to identify as a boy. Right? What the law is going to be saying now is that's discrimination. And so this means, whether you're a person of faith or not, you're just someone who thinks this is bad medicine, right? And there are good secular reasons for thinking it's bad medicine. You would now be violating civil rights. On the flip side, there's, and it's not explicit, so a lot will depend here on how the Biden people choose to interpret and enforce it. And my sense is that they're going to enforce it very broadly, because the preamble to the bill mentions that one of the reasons for the bill is to prevent what they call conversion therapy. And what they mean by conversion therapy here is that if you as a parent have a child who experiences gender dysphoria, let's say you have a girl who doesn't feel comfortable identifying as a girl, she identifies as a boy or non-binary or something like that, if you take her to see a therapist and the therapist practices good therapy to help your daughter feel comfortable being a girl, the activists call that conversion therapy. They say that discriminates against your child's so-called gender identity, which is now a boy, or gender ambidextrous, or gender non-binary. So this has huge implications for medicine, that you wouldn't be able to seek out good medicine, and then medical professionals, healthcare plans, doctors, insurance plans would have to prescribe, perform, and pay for bad medicine. all
So,
in the name of equality.
yeah, I mean, listen, I think people don't understand how sweeping that is because the other side often says, oh, it's just those people who don't want to, who are pro-life and don't want, their employees to have contraception or all the talking points. First of all, we're making nuns buy contraception and making them pay for it, in kind of some of this language that we've seen. But the Equality Act goes so far beyond just that line. If a surgeon performs mastectomies for cancer patients, they're forced to on teenage girls as well who have completely healthy bodies but are struggling, emotionally and mentally. And the doctor then has to go along or again lose that part of his quote unquote business or his medical services. That's an astonishing thing.
His
Well, look,
vocation. I mean, think about it. I mean, put this in, explicitly theological language. I mean, his vocation is to be a healer. And the government would be saying, you can no longer do healing for this aspect. You would just have to stop doing all of these surgeries. Whereas he's like, look, but this is how I heal in the case of breast cancer. It's not how I heal in the case of gender dysphoria. And so the government would actually be saying under civil rights law, what the appropriate medical healing is. And the other thing I should add is that imagine if you had a hospital that said, you identify as transgender, we won't treat you for COVID, right? That would be real discrimination against someone based on their gender identity. As far as we know, thank God, that never has happened during the past year. We have no news reports of a doctor or a hospital saying, oh, you identify as LGBT, we won't treat you. So they could have written this law very narrowly to say, look, you can't, be discriminating against people. But they didn't because they know they don't need a law for that because the problem isn't there. So they wrote it the way they wrote it precisely to cover the sex reassignment procedures. Right? So this is not a compromise, reasonable bill. Biden during the inauguration address said, I'm going to heal the nation. I'm going to unify the nation. This is probably the most divisive thing you could do on some of these social issues.
Yeah. So one fear that I have here on this, Ryan, is that we've talked about the Equality Act for years on the Colson Center's BreakPoint commentaries and other places. And I don't want people to hear that we're crying wolf. Like every time we say it, then it fails and so on. It's more like people standing on the shore seeing a tsunami wave coming. Like it's getting closer. It's getting closer. And the change in the political landscape is really what made, I think, a couple things escalate in importance. Number one is awareness of what the Equality Act does. This thing gets added to and rewritten and tweaked in between each version. And that's in the framing of a culture, being upstream from some of these ideas that make some of these ideas even thinkable in law, for at least large portions of the population. And, we're just getting closer to this. And it may be that we have to choose whether we're going to be the Jack Phillips of the next generation. It may be that we have to decide, look, I know what the law says, but this is where I have to stand because these issues are that important. But tell folks, since we just kind of thoroughly just kind of alarmed them to death, tell folks, look, Christ is risen, hope is certain, despair is a sin, and there is still a whole lot of ground we can work on. So could you walk people through maybe just in the few minutes we have left, 1, 2, 3 things, do this?
Yeah. All right. So first is pray. This is not just a political discussion or a legal, a vote, something like that. We should be praying. And we should be praying particularly for people who are experiencing gender dysphoria because they are being misserved by the medical community. They're being misserved by the politicians who don't really care. I think many politicians who are like, oh yeah, I'm voting for the Equality Act, haven't stopped to think for 10 minutes about what really is in the best interest of a young person with gender dysphoria. So pray, pray for the people suffering in this way. Pray for the political leaders, right? Pray that they have wisdom on this. A second thing, educate yourself. And what I mean by that is like my sense is that most of our listeners know how to talk about the abortion issue, right? Because we have like 40 years of, kind of public teaching about the right to life. And I imagine many of our listeners don't quite feel equipped to have that extended conversation about transgender issues, when they're at Little League practice or at a PTA meeting or around the water cooler. And so, Andrew Walker has written a really good book on this from a theological perspective. Abigail Schreier's written a really good book specifically on kind of the transgender phenomenon for high school and college age girls. I've written a mediocre book that covers like the entire, landscape, the philosophy, the medicine, the science. You can get Andrew's and Abigail's book still on Amazon. If you want my book, you have to go to the Colson Center bookstore.
BreakPoint.org. Click on the store thing. Yeah,
but seriously, I mean, I think the reason why people like Andrew, people like Abigail, people like me write these books is precisely to try to help people better understand what's going on, to then empower them to be better advocates. Yeah. And then the last thing I'll say is, look, elections have consequences. Had the vote in Georgia gone differently, the Senate wouldn't be in control of a party that is hostile to the truth. And so, I mean, just be a good citizen, be politically engaged, right? I mean, we don't have to say more because we have like a second left, but like, just, we have to pray, we have to, educate ourselves and then speak on these issues, and then we have to participate, we have to engage. So that's the 1, 2, 3.
That's a great 1, 2, 3. Ryan Anderson, Dr. Ryan Anderson is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Where can people find you online, Ryan, if they want to check you out?
Sure. On Twitter, it's at RyanTAND. So Ryan TAND. And then the Ethics and Public Policy Center website is www.eppc.org.
And we'll add all those links at our website, breakpoint.org. Click on the link for the show. Ryan, great to see you, my friend. Thanks so much for bringing so much clarity today.
Thank you.